Hello, my name is Michael Geib, and thank you so much for attending this presentation today. We're going to be talking about the great bassist Domenico Dragonetti, some of his solo and chamber music compositions, and how to perform them in a historically informed way. So thank you again for joining me on this musical journey. Domenico Dragonetti was considered the greatest performer of his age on the double bass, and is widely considered to be the first known virtuoso of the instrument. His style became so influential that the way that he bowed the instrument, which has become largely forgotten, became the standard method at the Royal School of Music in London around 1830. It's worth noting that Dragonetti's bow was convex versus most bows that are concave in the modern era. He was also a wonderful composer, having written over 31 string quintets, 6 string quartets, 9 concertos, and several other works for solo bass, bass and cello, and bass and piano. Now, the one that is arguably the most well-known is the Dragonetti Concerto in G major, which is performed quite frequently. I know for when I was learning with my teacher that it was kind of a rite of passage piece, if you will. The funny thing about this particular concerto is that it wasn't actually written by Dragonetti. Research shows that it was written by Edward Nani, who was the bass professor at the Paris Conservatory in the early 20th century. And what Nani probably did, he wrote a piece that was an homage to Dragonetti, dare we say, that also served as a pedagogical piece for his students to teach them to play in thumb position across the strings, play harmonics, etc. But what has happened over the years is that this has become the most well-known work supposedly by Dragonetti, yet he didn't actually write it. And all of these other pieces have been largely forgotten about. So how did we get here? Well, to move forward, we have to move backwards into the past. So Dragonetti was born in Venice in 1763 in Italy. And he studied with his father initially, who was an amateur musician, but then eventually studied with Michel Berini, who was considered the greatest bassist in Venice at the time. The story goes that after about 10, 11 lessons, something like that, Berini said to Dragonetti, "I have nothing more to teach you." And so Dragonetti's like, well, okay. So he went out on his own and started performing. He became the principal bass of the Venice Opera Buffa at age 13. At the age of 18, he joined the orchestra of the Chapel of St. Mark and became the principal of the same orchestra at the age of 24. And at the age of 31, he moved to London, largely because the Chapel of St. Mark could no longer afford to pay his desired salary. Once Dragonetti moved to London, he created a name for himself, giving numerous solo recitals and chamber concerts. He stopped giving solo recitals around 1815, though, and he performed in several orchestras, including those of the King's Theatre and the Philharmonic Society. He was the highest paid member of the Philharmonic Society from 1831 to 1842. And he performed for the London premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in 1825. He performed on numerous premieres that were important, but that just shows the level of musicality that was part of his normal day, shall we say. And he passed away in 1846 at the age of 83, which was a profoundly old age given that time period. So it's quite obvious that Dragonetti was well known and well respected within the London music community. He was acquainted with several now well-known composers, including but not limited to Felix Mendelssohn, Franz Liszt, Niccolo Paganini, Joseph Haydn, and most notably, Ludwig van Beethoven. And the story goes, upon their meeting, Beethoven had been told that his new friend could execute violoncello music upon his huge instrument. And one morning, when Dragonetti called at his room, he expressed his desire to hear a sonata. The contrabass was sent for, and the Sonata No. 2 of Opus 5 was selected. Beethoven played his part, with his eyes immovably fixed upon his companion, and in the finale, where the arpeggios occur, was so delighted and excited that at the close he sprang up and threw his arms around both the player and instrument. So it is worth noting that Ludwig van Beethoven, considered by many to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest composer in Western music history, was driven to embrace a double bass player while he was playing one of his own cello sonatas, which just shows you the remarkable level of Dragonetti's virtuosity in his lifetime. And we can't point to one moment in terms of the development of the double bass, but it is only reasonable to assume Beethoven's treatment of the instrument would have been affected by Dragonetti's powers. And I don't know about the rest of you, but the next time you're working on the excerpts from the third movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and you want to throw your metronome at the wall like I often do, then you can thank Dragonetti for showing Beethoven that that was possible to write for the instrument. So again, it's very obvious that Dragonetti was well known and well respected. And he also wrote a lot of music. But what happened to it? Why don't we play it? Why isn't it played in chamber ensembles? What happened? There are several factors that, while not a single one of them can really explain why this happened, once they're pieced together, paint a better picture about why these works have largely been ignored or forgotten in time. One thing to consider is that during Dragonetti's lifetime, the double bass as we know it now was not considered the normal or standard contrabass instrument. At that time, what was probably considered more standard would have been the violone, which is either a 5 or 6 string instrument with a flat back that's a member of the viola da gamba family, and it was tuned in a combination of fourths and thirds and had frets. So it was decidedly a different instrument, but Dragonetti said, hey, if we tune in fourths and we get rid of the frets, we can do anything a violinist can. But that viewpoint was largely not accepted during his lifetime, and in fact he was seen as the outlier. So all of this to say that Dragonetti's music was not performed by his own contrabass colleagues, dare we say, in the music community, contrabass instrument colleagues, because one, the music was probably too difficult for them to play, and two, they were playing a completely different instrument. Another reason is that bass, the contrabass or the modern double bass, has largely been ignored and forgotten in string chamber music in general because the publishers, specifically in the 20th century, anytime they saw the word basso in a score, they assumed it meant violoncello, which was not always the case, which kind of by default made cello the normal bass instrument in chamber music, which was not necessarily the case. So to have a double bass at all was seen as strange. Hence, publishers would shy away from the music. And of course, we can thank Joseph Haydn and the string quartet, which is arguably the most common and standard of string chamber groups. The string quartet is 2 violins, viola, and cello, not a double bass. So we've been largely ignored in that repertoire, and it's never really been a standard part of string chamber music in general. And then finally, it's worth noting, Dragonetti didn't really teach. It's not that he never taught lessons, it's just that he never was a professor at a conservatory, for example. We mentioned Edward Nani, but Nani was able to pass on his music to his students, who then passed it on to their students, etc. And that hence pieces, regardless of why they're learned, get passed on through generations. The same can be said for Franz Simondl, who taught at the Prague Conservatory. But because Dragonetti never had a stream of pupils that passed on his pedagogy, not only did we lose that style of bowing, but we also lost a lot of music that he probably would have taught to his students. So all of these things combined together can ultimately explain why so much of Dragonetti's music has been lost in time. That was until about 10 or so years ago when John Feeney, who's the principal double bassist of the Orchestra of St. Luke's, took it upon himself to revitalize and re-explore some of Dragonetti's music. Before he started, he admittedly said, I didn't think his music would be any good. but was pleasantly surprised to find that there was this treasure trove of not only solo music for the bass, but also string chamber music that not only included the double bass, but featured the double bass as a solo instrument, which is something I know all of us have been yearning for a long time. And I've included just a few additions that you can check out in the presentation PowerPoint, and feel free to check out the solos for yourself or your students, and they're wonderful pieces of music and can finally bring the bass more to the forefront. One I'd like to focus on specifically is Dragonetti's Quintet number 18, because this is a wonderful example of a string chamber music piece that not only features the double bass as the soloist, but it also features Dragonetti's wonderful compositional techniques and just the depth of his music writing and how it reached a much more profound level than I think many people realize. So this particular piece, it's written for a string quintet that includes one violin, two violas, and a cello as the accompaniment quartet, and then features the double bass as the solo instrument. So we're going to take a listen here in just a second to some excerpts, but I'll point out one of the important performance considerations among many, and that's mainly the tuning. Scholars generally believe that the pitch that was used to tune to in the past was lower than it is today, for the most part. How much lower is a point of contention? Some people say this, some people say that, some people say A415, some people say A425, other people say A430 versus the standard A440 that we use. But in this particular recording, it's worth noting that John Feeney and the Loma Mar Quartet are performing at an A430. So it's a little bit lower than our modern pitch, but not much lower. So here's our A440. And here's our A430. So just a little bit lower, but not too much lower, and it kind of provides a slightly darker sound that I think resonates well with the double bass. So now enjoy the excerpts from this quintet, and I've included the score to the examples that you can follow along with. So one personal story I'd like to share about this particular piece. I first performed it in 2011, and I just remember that the quartet that I hired seemed a little skeptical about playing this piece. And after the end of our first read-through of just the first movement, the violinist popped up and said, "This is lovely." To which I was glad that they enjoyed playing it, but it also showed the skepticism that surrounds double bassists that are also composers. But this piece just is a small representation of Dragonetti's wonderful compositional style that has largely been forgotten about. And there's no better compliment than one from ISB founder Gary Carr, who had this to say about this piece in this edition. "Double bassists are so hungry for music that they can perform in a soloistic way, with other musicians that this unveiling of Dragonetti's chamber music will undoubtedly have an enormous global impact on the lives of a large percentage of double bassists. At last, we double bassists are given more to do than supply the foundation and rhythm of the music. I salute John for his efforts, and I look forward with great pleasure and anticipation to the impact they will have in the future of double bass playing. And if that's not a great compliment, I don't know what is. So we've talked a little bit about Dragonetti's chamber music, but he's also written wonderful music for the unaccompanied solo double bass. And these are pieces that are very near and dear to my heart. Later in his life, in the early 1840s, we suspect, Dragonetti wrote 12 solo waltzes for the double bass. And they, as far as I can tell from the research I've done, they're the first pieces written for the solo unaccompanied double bass that in existence that I know of. There were pieces for piano and other things like that and with other accompaniment, but these are truly meant to be played solo, which is one of the wonderful things about them. There are 12 in all, and I mentioned the wonderful Henley edition of all 12 of them that you can look up. When I first learned them, it was actually from the edition by the great Bertram Turetsky, which was released in 1976. So these pieces, they do require a higher level of technical proficiency. They're not meant for a beginner, but they are written specifically for the double bass. And I point that out because these days it's become standard for us to learn excerpts from the Johann Sebastian Bach cello suites, which are lovely pieces of music, don't get me wrong. The only problem is those pieces aren't written for us, and it's just that much harder to get them to sound as they are supposed to. I'm reminded of this every day. My wife is a cellist, and so I hear the cello suites as they were intended, and then go back to banging my head against the wall, trying to get them to sound that way. So while these pieces do require a more advanced student, or at least a good intermediate student, they provide a wonderful opportunity to play music that was written for us. So I encourage all of us to encourage that. And the pieces are quite showy. These pieces tell us about Dragonetti's showmanship, his skill, and his response to the appetite to the public. And as one critic said, Dragonetti used his instrument as Jupiter his lightning bolts. And that's what these pieces really reflect, is the showmanship aspect of Dragonetti. A little bit about them. All the tempos are quite fast. Again, they're showy pieces. Vivace, presto, allegro. There's no moderato or largo or even allegretto. They're all quite fast. The waltzes are an A-B-A form, da capo form, which is very common of the era, meaning that you have one section, opening themes with repeats, then you have another section with repeats, and then we repeat back to the first section without the repeats. And that's the structure of all of them. So they're such a wonderful resource, and my hope and goal is to help make these a standard part of our repertoire. Something as standard as, say, the Eccles Sonata, which is not written for double bass, but these are. So please check them out, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised in learning them for yourselves or teaching them to your students. Lastly, before we get on with the performance, I'd like to talk about how I've made this historically informed. As we like to say in this side of the business, we like to keep it hip with historically informed performance. So what I'll be doing today, because with historically informed performance, the goal is to make it sound as it did when the music was first written and first performed. So what I'll be doing is I'm playing on first a very old instrument. This is a late 18th century Italian double bass. It says fretless, but obviously there aren't frets. But that's just to point out that there were a lot of contrabass instruments with frets during that time period. This bass is affectionately known as Francesca, the baby bass, and she would have been used as probably a Baroque chamber or church bass. She's very small and much closer to the size of a modern half-size bass. I'm playing on gut strings. Now, for those of you that don't know, prior to World War II, strings were usually made out of animal intestine, hence the name gut. But after World War II, we switched to more synthetic materials and using metal strings or some type of other synthetic to make up what was put into the strings themselves. But it's worth noting that while we've gotten used to that sound, especially because of when most of the recordings have been made after World War II, the majority of the lives of these stringed instruments were actually played on gut strings, and that was how the music was intended to sound. The strings sound very, very different. They're much darker, they're warmer, not nearly as bright or in your face. So I hope you'll get a sense of that. I am tuned in fourths, just like a modern bass, but that was the way Dragonetti tuned. I will point out Dragonetti played a 3-string double bass as opposed to a 4-string, but his top 3 strings were tuned to A, D, G, just like we do today. And forgive me, but I did not take my E string off for the performance, as I thought that might be a bit gratuitous. As far as tuning, we've mentioned different tunings and temperaments and things like that. I'm tuned at an A415 today. Now, the reason for that, number one, we mentioned how scholars believe that the A should be lower than it is today in terms of historical performance. But how much lower is a point of contention? We've already discussed how John Feeney used an A430. Well, I'm tuned at A415 for a couple reasons. One, it is lower than our modern pitch. And two, it's actually the standard pitch for the British Center for Historical Performance. It's the pitch we use to tune our harpsichords, and so that's where this instrument lives most of the time. Just so we hear how much lower it is, here's an A440 again. And then here's an A415. So it's about half a step lower than our modern tuning pitch, which is something worth noting. One thing that we take for granted in the modern era also is how we stand or sit with the instrument. But back then, just as there weren't metal strings, there were not metal end pins that they could adjust the height. So bassists would either have to just sit with the instrument on the ground and have to find a stool that worked, or they would have to either just live with it being lower, or they'd have to find something to prop up the instrument a little higher to accommodate their height. You can look online at pictures of Battistini. You actually see little wooden dowels sometimes to do that. So what I'm doing, I actually have a custom-made wooden end pin that was made by KC Strings, which if you ever need anything for the bass, go to KC Strings because they'll do it right the first time, every time. And I wish they were paying me to tell you that. So, but they made this beautiful custom wooden end pin for me, and it has surprisingly increased the resonance of the instrument, and I didn't think it would make as much of a difference. Although Dragonetti, from what we know, sat most of the time, his colleagues that stood would have used something like this, so that's how I'm choosing to perform today. And lastly, but of course not least, I'll be playing with this Dragonetti style bow. This is a copy of one of Dragonetti's bows that's in the Florence Museum. And once again, I'll point out that it is convex, not concave. This was made by David Herman, and who you should definitely check out if you're looking for any modern replicas of historical bows. He has bows like this, copies of Sperger bows, etc. So go check out all the stuff he has to offer. The one big difference with this bow versus a bow that Dragonetti would have used is that this bow has a screw to tighten the hair, much like most modern bows do. But Dragonetti's bow actually did not have a screw. He would use his pinky to tighten the hair as he was playing. And so that's, if you're ever wondering why for your traditional German bow grip, why our pinky's on the string, that's one of the big reasons that that happens. So thank you again for coming along with me on this journey today. I hope you've learned something about Dragonetti, his musical compositions, and also a little bit about historically informed performance. I now ask you to sit back and enjoy this performance of Dragonetti's 6 waltzes for double bass alone.